Oh, actually, I know one of our peoples got exposed to the virus and is out for the 2 weeks or whatever. We need better rapid testing. My God, please. But, okay. What we're going to do is get into some basic chemistry so we can then get into basic biochemistry. And this really is, for sure my jam here. And I do pretty good with some of the diseases and things. Some of the bacterial classifications, I'm reading off the damn slide, sorry. But this stuff, I got this. All right, so the reason we have to go through this is we're going to start talking about macromolecules, these things like proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and their behavior. And the way they behave is dependent on the kinds of bonds that they can make and the different kind of bond interactions. In order to talk about bonds, we need to start getting into the actual structure of the atom. And so we can kind of then from there move up. So we got atoms. And this is the base, smallest thing you can separate out that still has identity. That is, when you get below the unit of the atom, you get the protons, neutrons, and electrons. They're generic. At the atom level, though, you have different kinds of identities. And it's one of the things I still kind of go, wow, how can this be? In that you've got stuff like oxygen, which is obviously critical to life, made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons. You take the same subatomic particles, mix them in slightly different concentrations, and you can make arsenic, which is deadly poison, or lead, which is a cumulative poison, or you can make something that is completely inert, like argon, or you can make something that'll blow up in the toilet, like phosphorus, when you throw it in there, and sodium metal. And I still kind of go, really? But that is how this thing works. So or hopefully, how many of you want to watch Breaking Bad? It's one of the prerequisites for the course. I'm not sure if it listed or not. Have you seen all of them?
Not the current one, but I watched it like season 7.
Okay. Well, so you've seen to the end of Breaking Bad then, or no? Not quite?
At the very end.
All right. I won't spoil anything. But you know how it begins with the periodic chart. All right. If you haven't seen this, you know the periodic chart of the elements, whatever, look up the book. And what this is starting with hydrogen, which has 1 proton. You add a second proton, you get helium, and you have this chart of the elements. Each element represents 1 more proton added to the atomic nucleus. And that's, again, one of the things I go, really? That's all it is? But you change element identity simply by adding a proton. And we're talking about an atomic nucleus at the level of the proton, a really, really spacious spot. In that, if you were to take and think about a proton being the size of a basketball, the atomic nucleus is something like the size of a football field. And the electron is orbiting around way up in the skyboxes. So there's like a huge amount of space inside these atoms. And what we can then begin to do is add more and more protons to this, this football field. Now, if we've got the same number of protons as neutrons, then that is the standard form of the element. And just this little point here, just to note, the proton is positively charged. The neutron has no charge. The electron has a negative charge. And if the proton number and the electron number are equivalent, then there is no charge on the atom. If the proton number and the electron number are different, we have what's called an ion. You got an extra electron, it carries a negative charge. If you have missing an electron, or more than one, you're carrying a positive charge. Now, neutrons, because they don't have a charge, you can swap those around, and what you end up doing is, by removing a neutron, you're not changing the element's identity, you're creating something that's called an isotope. And an isotope of the element will chemically behave like the element, but it can be unstable and decay, which is radioactivity. And so, as it turns out, the most common form of hydrogen on the planet is, in fact, just a naked proton. So, when we got just a proton with its positive charge, that is hydrogen. Hydrogen with a neutron is actually an unstable isotope called deuterium. And then you can have a third, and you make the unstable isotope known as tritium. But there you go. So we'll talk a little bit about isotopes and things with various experiments maybe, but for the most part, we don't need to worry about that. All right, so the atomic number is what we're looking at with the periodic table. And that is the number of protons. That's really all that we need to pay attention to. All right, so ions then, they've got a charge to them. And one way you can tell if a solution is an ion, or if a compound is able to form an ion, is if it can carry less charge. And another thing to keep in mind is we're talking about the chemistry in water pretty much all the time. So when we start thinking about bond strength and stuff, it has to do with these guys in water, because biochemistry has got to have water in order to be, carrying out its operations and things. All right. So what we're going to do then is begin adding these atoms together, and this is how we start to make bonds. I usually write this. I'll let you write this. I don't know. One of the critical points when we start thinking about bonds is their strength and their relative strength. So we start out with the number one strongest bond, the covalent bond. The covalent bond is defined as an equal sharing of electrons. And this is going to be the strongest bond we can see in our basic sort of biochemistry. A way I think about it is, the energy that it takes to make the bond is equivalent to the energy that it takes to create the bond. And so to break covalent bonds for most organic molecules, you have to set them on fire. So when you're thinking about how much heat does it take to set a piece of paper on fire, that's the energy it takes to break that covalent bond. And just as a little point, short of like a volcano or something, you're not going to find a spot on the planet that is breaking covalent bonds. There's no place that's hot enough to do that. So you got to put stuff in your oven, crank it up to 450 degrees, and only then can you start to char stuff. And so, just think about this when you're baking cookies. If you've got the temperature below 450, it'll brown, and it may even dry out, but it ain't going to char. It's not going to get black. Only when you get it above 450 are you going to actually get charring going on. So, grilling is like running at 700-800 degrees. And so, yeah, you definitely get charring. So covalent bonds, man, you just are not breaking those. Those are tough. Now, ionic bonds in an aqueous system, in a watery system, are actually way weaker than the covalent. So ionics are our number two, and they are way behind number two. So this is like taking a molecule of sodium, which is carrying a positive charge, it's missing an electron, and a molecule of chlorine, which is carrying an extra electron, and putting them together. So we can define then an ionic bond as an unequal sharing of electrons. Now, typically strong, yeah, but not nearly as strong as a covalent bond. Just as an example, you can get pretty much most ionic bonds will begin to dissociate when you get them in water, or at least they're going to, putting salt into water, the water has sufficient energy in it to actually begin breaking the covalent bonds, to begin breaking the ionic bonds. I'll add that out. All right, so if you take a pound of sugar and put that into water and mix it up, and then in one bucket, and then take a pound of salt and mix that into water, and then have your roommate stand in the salt water, you stand in the sugar water, and take an extension cord and have your third roommate say, okay, let's do this experiment. You strip off the ends of the extension cord so you have two raw wires, plug it in, and you have your third roommate say, all right, come over here and put it into your bucket of water. Now, standing in sugar, because sugar is covalently bonded, there is not going to be any kind of electrical current passing through it, at least if it's really pure water and you wash your feet really well. But your roommate over here in the salt, which he thinks, hey, it's the same thing. I mean, it's a white powder, it dissolved. Because when you put it into water, it dissociates, and you now have a charge. You can carry electricity through salt water like a big dog. So, covalents aren't going to break. Even when they go into solution, they're not breaking. Ionics, they break pretty darn easily. Our third bond, and actually doing this is like itself, our third bond is my favorite, what we call the hydrogen bond. Polar, otherwise, polar interactions. Essentially what we've got is, wait for it, this. We got a water molecule. So the reason water is actually sort of an interesting molecule, and more so than perhaps you think about it, is that oxygen here is an atom that is said to be electronegative, meaning that it's a bit of an electron hog, and the electrons tend to cloud around it. And so, equal is as equal does. The oxygen-hydrogen bond is a covalent bond, but to say it's an equal sharing, it's not so equal because the oxygen's got a whole lot of electrons around it, and it has a slight negative charge. The hydrogens very rarely get the electron out to them, and so they have a slight positive charge. When you mix water you have more than one molecule of water, which would be a very teeny drop. When you start putting water in a glass, you end up having this charge interaction in which the positive charge in hydrogen interacts with the negative charge in oxygen, and you create, in this case, a specialized ionic interaction or charge interaction that we call the hydrogen bond. Now, hydrogen bonds in biochemistry are so critical because they can be formed very easily and they can be broken very easily. They're kind of like the Velcro of biochemistry. And that if we have structures that need to change shape, we probably will be invoking hydrogen bonding to change that. But one of the things about hydrogen bonds is they are very delicate bonds. So water boils, of course, at 100 degrees, and when you boil water, you are breaking those hydrogen bonds. Now, most hydrogen bonds in biochemistry or biochemical molecules aren't that tough. Most of the hydrogen bonds that we have in the biomolecules in our body and in biochemistry, they begin to break and start falling apart like 120 degrees or so, 110 degrees even, and this is Fahrenheit. So a really hot bath, that actually is sufficient to start breaking apart the hydrogen bonds. And we're going to see why this is so important is that when we start talking about proteins, protein structure is very often dictated by hydrogen bonds. And so if we can begin breaking hydrogen bonds, we can disrupt the structure of protein. And so consequently, you don't got to heat stuff up all that hot in order to make those molecules change shape and become non-functional. That's why we start thinking about, like pasteurization, raising the temperature up not all that high for not all that long will in fact cause these hydrogen bonds to break. So they are an important guy. The last bond or interaction that we got is kind of the chemistry catch-all, what we call van der Waals forces. And I think the chemists will invoke van der Waals forces if they can't think of anything else of why this is happening. So why is that happening? Must be van der Waals forces. This is the interactions that happen within complex molecules or between molecules when things get really, really close. And it's a very, very weak interaction. And honestly, other than the fact that Mr. van der Waal gives me a Christmas card every year, I would never mention his name. No, the dude's way dead, and van der Waals forces, yeah, whatever. I don't care. I personally never invoke van der Waals forces. All right, so here are just actually some pictures. The covalent bond, we have electrons, and they are zooming around. And so in a covalent bond, we've got this electron basically running in a figure eight. An ionic bond, we have sodium that is missing an electron compared to its proton number, and it desperately wants an extra electron, kind of like, he just so wants a bunny to pet, and he can't have it. And the chloride has an extra electron, and it is absolutely sick of having all these electrons floating around. And it says, here, take this damn electron. And that's how we end up then with an ionic bond. Hydrogen bonds, here's their drawing. Oxygen with the electrons clustered here, and then the weak force of opposite charges. And there we go. All right. So that then leads us to the next really critical part in biochemistry. And that is the different kinds of what we call macromolecules. And what is critical is to think about and learn what makes them up. Now, boop, boop. Let's go to the board for sure here. So, hello. When we think about the biopolymers, it's a little bit like, or it's a biochemist's version of the food pyramid or the food groups. Eat, 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 eat. So I'm quite the cooking geek, and I actually started really thinking about some of the biochemistry of food, making caramel one Halloween. And the breaking down that occurs when you take sugar and you begin to caramelize it is like phenomenally complicated chemistry, organic chemistry going on. And that really got me thinking about this. And so my non-majors class I often teach is the biochemistry of food. And so I have turned a lot of my biochemistry attention into food preparation, and thinking about how you can really couch recipes and the creation of food. I probably should be sitting in front of the camera. In terms of biochemistry. And just as a thought, has anybody ever heard of something called sous vide cooking? It is a new thing in that you can take like a piece of meat, stick it into a Ziploc bag, pull the air out of it, and put it in a water bath that is at 120 degrees. And 120 degrees, this is Fahrenheit, your hot water tank is probably coming out about 140. 120, you can put your hands into it, and you're not going to want to take a bath in that, but it's not like so hot that you're going to scream. It's like Whoa, that's hot. That is hot enough to begin breaking down hydrogen bonds. And so consequently, when we start thinking about cooking, what we're doing is disrupting these weak bonds. If you cook by breaking covalent bonds, you're burning stuff. But when we start cooking, we're breaking apart ionic bonds and hydrogen bonds. So we have our macromolecules. And these are, we can categorize them like this. Oops, I don't like that marker. Where's my giant marker? We got your basic sugars, sugar polymers, carbohydrates, the lipid fat class, proteins, and nucleic acids. Now, when we start talking about these molecules in biochemistry, very quickly we start linking these molecules together to create what we call a macromolecule. And all of these guys, we can begin sort of talking about them in the form of what we call a polymer. And a polymer is a really big molecule made up of monomers. So you take a bunch of monomers and link them together and you create a polymer. And you're standing around and holding on to all kinds of polymers if you have a piece of plastic. So you've heard of polyethylene or polystyrene or polypropylene. These are polymers. And so with polyethylene, you take a 2-carbon molecule that's got a double bond between it, that is the ethylene molecule, and you start linking them together. And you link together a bazillion of them, and you make polyethylene, make plastic. So this is an example of a polymer. And when we start thinking about polymers, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. First, we can define polymers by what the monomer is. And that's one of the ways we want to start thinking about these different individual biopolymers, is what are their monomers. Second, and this is just sort of a general rule to keep in mind, is we generally are going to link the monomers with something called a condensation reaction. Whenever you're looking at sort of the hardcore chemistry of this, and for our purposes, we're not going to do too much of this, and you're linking two monomers together, how do you make a molecule of water? Is the way you're going to link them together. And I'll show you how that works in a moment. The opposite is true when we break apart monomers, or break apart polymers, that we're going to liberate the free monomers. It's going to be using what's called a hydrolysis reaction, where we're going to actually add a molecule of water. This condensation reaction is also known as a dehydration reaction, just so you see that in the terms. You're pulling a molecule of water out, or you're adding a molecule of water to it to break it apart. All right, so let's just very quickly go through these different macromolecules. And what's happening? Do I need to be careful? No. Is it my thing is binging? Maybe. Or is it you? Regardless. A good way of categorizing this, and this is sort of just a good list, sort of a chart to make, is the biopolymers and the monomers that make them. So carbohydrates, this is using sugars. And an example of a carbohydrate polymer might be cellulose. Now, when we start talking about bacteria specifically, we'll have bacteria cell walls, which are often made up of a great big sugar polymer. There are toxins that bacteria produce that are often sugar polymers, or sugar polymers linked with a few, like with some amino acids and things. So we'll be seeing a term called peptidoglycans, which is a kind of candy coating that many bacteria have in using a lot of sugars. But cellulose, wood, is a real common polymer that you're familiar with. Another one would be starch. Both of these are glucose polymers. So you take glucose, sugar, well, it is a standard sugar. If you're doing athletics, you might be taking glucose supplement tabs and things. It is the sugar in pixie sticks. And you start linking a bazillion of them together, and you make these really big molecules. One of the main claims to fame are things to think about with carbohydrates and sugar polymers is because glucose sugars typically have a whole lot of OH groups on them. They can form real intense hydrogen bonded networks. So when we want to stick things together, we use a lot of sugars. In animals, we've got all kinds of long chain sugars that are in the synovial fluid and the joints in your different big joints. And this creates almost like a thickened lubricant to keep your joints from rubbing against the bones from rubbing against each other. So things like gelatin is another great carbohydrate polymer example of it causing thickening. If you've ever made a flour-based gravy, you add the flour, you heat it up with the milk, and when it cools, the hydrogen bonding reforms, and you make pudding, or a very thick goo. And that is primarily because sugars have a huge amount of hydroxyl, or OH groups on them. The lipid fat class doesn't really fit exactly into the polymer monomer category, but not bad. And the base structure here is something called a fatty acid. And typically, these are non-polar. And these are things like oils and fats, triglycerides. And we'll actually talk a little bit more about specific kinds of fatty acid polymers and things that make up the cell membrane. So proteins, these are made up of amino acids. And just when we start getting a little bit into some basic genetics and things, we should keep this in mind. There are 20 amino acids. And not to belabor the basic structure of an amino acid, which we'll be interested in a bit, but it looks like this. In that you've got this base structure of an amine group and an acid, carboxylic acid group, and then you've got what we call in the biz the R group. And the R group can be one of 20 side chains. And this is what makes proteins do their thing. We'll get into this in a bit as we start linking together amino acids to make a long chain protein. So proteins can be anywhere from insulin is 50 amino acids to the main protein in muscle is several thousand amino acids. And bacteria will have a whole range of amino acid structures, proteins, of different lengths. The reason this is important is that the genetic information stored in the DNA dictates the amino acid sequence of a protein. Because that's what a protein ends up being, is an amino acid sequence. And that amino acid sequence is determined by the DNA. We'll be getting into this when we start talking about mutations and things later. Let's see. Another critical class, of course, is nucleic acids. This is DNA and RNA, and the base polymer is called the nucleotide. This is, things like the AT and GC of DNA sequence. So these are basic kinds of macromolecules. Now, living organisms have to have a whole range of ions and a whole lot of other non-carbon-based material. You gotta have phosphate, you're gonna have calcium, magnesium and iron, all kinds of different other elements. But pretty much, when we start talking about living organisms in biochemistry, you're talking about these four macromolecules. So they are all made up of, they're all polymers and made up of these individual monomers. And so here we are. Amino acids, the polymer is the protein, also known as a polypeptide. The monosaccharide, a sugar, we make a polysaccharide, or carbohydrate. Nucleotides make up nucleic acids. Fatty acids make up fats, things like triglycerides and stuff. So when you're looking at blubber or a nicely marbled piece of fat, or if you were to excavate in my belly, you would find sort of lard. And this is pretty much pure triglyceride. All right. So when we start linking these things together, we have the addition of water or pulling water out. Now, a dehydration synthesis is what we use to add monomers, and you generate a loss of water. And hydrolysis is removing water. And this brings up, actually maybe this bit in here. Yeah. We'll go through this and we'll come back to a little bit more of this. So here's just an example of carbohydrates. I'm not going to ask you the structure, but some basic characteristics of carbohydrates. As we say, they're very polar, they dissolve well in water. One of the key points of a carbohydrate is it's got a lot of OH molecules. So all this OH stuff. And that generates the ability to make hydrogen bonds whenever you see an OH. And so we've got all kinds of different OH groups and very subtle changes that we can think about different kinds of sugars, glucose and fructose, linking them together, and you make sucrose, which is what you think of as white table sugar. Then you take glucose molecules and start linking them together, and you can make stuff like starch and glycogen. So these can be structural components, and they're also food. So fats, typically they are nonpolar molecules, and we'll throw out here in just a moment, there's a really specific and important class of fats that we call phospholipids. And these are using this 3-carbon glycerin backbone, and you can add 3 fatty acids and you make a triglyceride. And I'll show you here in just a moment that you can make this very specific diglyceride that is really important. So let's see. Generally, they're nonpolar. Generally, they don't dissolve in water, i.e., oil and water don't mix. We use them for energy. I mean, there's a lot of calories in fats you can extract. They are used as insulation, padding. So you want to have a nice fat pad. at places where you have pressure. Bacteria don't necessarily do that. Bacteria use lipids partly for forming membranes and also as energy structures. Another class that we throw into the lipid class that is not a fatty acid is what we think of as a sterol, or a what you know perhaps the steroid. And this is often based on cholesterol, which is this fairly complex ring structured guy here. And there are a variety of molecules, things like testosterone, corticosteroids, vitamin D, that are based on the cholesterol backbone. So, let's see. All right. How do I do this on the board? Let's do this on the board for a few more minutes. Okay. So the carbohydrates are fairly easy, and there ain't a whole lot going on with them. I mean, one of the things to start thinking about, or I'm hoping that you will describe here, that's going to drive me crazy. Stop it. I feel a little bit like a cat. I don't want a backpack. So, carbohydrates don't form a whole lot of complex structure. I mean, sugars are negatively charged. You link a bunch of them together, it's just a big stretch of negative charges. They make pudding. I love them. Thank you. And they're sweet. I enjoy eating my carbohydrates, no problem. But they're not particularly structurally interesting macromolecules. When we get into the lipid class, things become a bit more interesting in the following way. So, here is a way we can think of our lipids. And we've got the 3-carbon, and can you see that? Yeah, sure you can see it. The 3-carbon chain of glycerin. Glycerin is what's known as a sugar alcohol. It's got OH groups coming off of each carbon. Just a little bit of basic organic chemistry. Carbon always has to have 4 bonds on it. So if you ain't got 4 lines coming off your carbon, you're not drawing it right. Now, what we're going to do is link together fatty acids. Now, a fatty acid looks like this. It's got this back end part that's called the carboxylic acid, and then it's got a very long set of carbons, very often 18 carbons. And so and that ain't even 18. And then you can put the hydrogens in. Now, in chemistry, they generally draw things with a line drawing, but I kind of like putting in all the hydrogens so you can see what's going on here. A, you can see why this is called a hydrocarbon, because it's pretty much all hydrogens and carbons. B, there's a lot of energy in there. And C, there's not a whole lot of polarity. This little OH group here is a charged part. But for the most part, this molecule is extremely nonpolar, and so it's not water soluble. What we're going to do is link this fatty acid to the glycerin. And we do it in the following way. We're going to make a molecule of water. So we're going to now take this and spin it that way. So it looks like this. All right, so all we did was just spun it around. And looking to make a molecule of water, H2O, we're going to take an oxygen and 2 hydrogens off, like that, and make a carbon-oxygen bond. That is how we link a fatty acid. Now, when we do this, we have made a molecule of water that we pulled out, dehydrating this thing, and so it's called a dehydration reaction or a condensation reaction. So we can do that again here with another fatty acid, and we've gone from a monoglyceride to a diglyceride and we can do it one more time, to form a triglyceride. So if you've ever done blood work, one of the things that they do in your lipid panel is they look at cholesterol and how it's being bound up in what's called high-density lipoprotein or low-density lipoprotein, because lipids they're not water soluble, so in order to move them around in the body, you've got to have them bound up in the protein so they're not going to be just like, oil droplets in your blood. LDL and HDL. You also have a triglyceride number. And as we get older, our triglyceride number starts to go up. The triglycerides, when they get to be too high, they can end up forming fatty deposits on arteries and causing problems. So, this is a triglyceride. Now, we're going to be talking about cell membranes, and there's a very critical glycerin structure that is part of cell membranes. Rather than having a third fatty acid tail, we instead have a phosphate molecule. Now this is critical because phosphates carry a giant stinking negative charge, a massive negative charge. Now I'm not big on camp cheers and I don't have any tattoos, but one that you might want to do, or a camp cheer you might want to think about, is that whenever you see or hear phosphate, you immediately think negative charge. So if I say phosphate, what did you just think?
Negative charge.
Thank you. I wanted to have like sort of a church revival thing. Phosphate, negative charge. All right, the truth is, we may joke about this. This is the fundamental stuff behind energy transfer in living organisms. This is, in fact, what's happening with cancer. Phosphates drive everything, and because of this negative charge, it is a really potent kind of molecule. So phosphate has a negative charge. And what happens then is we make this really weird molecule. So we're going to spin this phosphate up. And we draw it like this, where we have a head that is the phosphate head, and then the two tails of the fatty acid. So this is known as a phospholipid. So here are the fatty acids. The fatty acid tail. And if we think about this, this is a schizophrenic molecule in that this is highly charged. I mean, it's carrying that massive negative charge. And this is completely oily, non-polar. Now, this is a molecule that doesn't know what the hell it wants to do. It's actually referred to as an amphipathic molecule. It's got a charged head and a non-polar tail. It is amphipathic. All right, so an amphipathic molecule interacts with water in a really, really cool way. And it's the last thing we'll hit on today. But if we take phospholipid, as these are called, and mix it with water, watch what happens. We've got the phosphate head and the fatty acid tails come together. The fatty acid tails are having their own little fat party, non-polar interaction. The phosphate heads are able to interact with water. And if you have the salt concentration right, that's an O, and the phospholipid concentration right, you can make what we call the phospholipid bilayer. This is actually something called a micelle. That is what fat or phospholipid droplets look like in water. But you can sort of maneuver them in a way to make the cell membrane. So that's why phospholipids are so critical, because the external environment that cells are going to be in, typically, pretty much always, is going to be aqueous. Like, red blood cells, the serum is watery. The internal environment that cells face, or that are inside the cytoplasm, is also an aqueous environment. And so having this sort of amphipathic molecule makes it so you can interact with the aqueous stuff on the outside of the inside, and then we have this fatty acid tail in the middle. So this is a critical biomolecule. On Monday, we will pick up on proteins, which are by far the most complicated kind of guy, and see how they work. All right. So that was week 1. We'll see.